You read them and you get confused. Where am I?
Well, occasionally there is a reference to an event which took place.
You got it. There you go. Like קצת מבולבל, huh?
I'll bring a chair, don't worry.
Here, let me come.
Good morning, welcome to everybody for Sold Out House. It's great pleasure for us, honor for us, that the third lecture of the third year of the Herbert Berman Memorial Series, that Norman Podhoretz is found him willing at short notice to come over from Herzliya and leave the global problems of Israel to devote some time to us. I welcome here the president of the center, Dori Gold. I also announce our next lecture for the French speakers next Tuesday, Gérard Hubert, La psychanalyse de l'antisémitisme, 10 o'clock, for those among you who speak French and come to our French lectures. I would like to draw your attention to the interview with Andrei Markovits, which is the latest post-Holocaust and anti-Semitism, which we have just put up on the similarities and differences between Europe's anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism, which I think is a very original piece. We have also out there the interview we published in our Jerusalem Viewpoint series on the countervailing trends in American Jewry, the interview with Norman Podhoretz. Well, it's a pleasure to have perhaps the most influential American intellectual with us, man who, as editor of Commentary, has had a profound influence on American thinking for a period of more than 4 decades. Became editor of Commentary in 1960, from which he retired in 1995, but today's editor-at-large of the magazine. The most recent of the 10 books he has published are Ex-Friends, My Love Affair with America, The Cautionary Tale of a Cheerful Conservative, The Prophets, something very different, who they were, what they are. This doesn't speak about modern prophets, this is more about the real stuff. And the Norman Podhoretz Reader, a selection of his writings from the 1950s through the 1990s. Before I ask him to speak, I would like to ask the journalists among you, if you make a reference to this lecture, please mention that it took place at the JCPA. The subject today, in our usual format, half-an-hour lecture, then remarks, questions, will be the attacks on the neoconservatives in the United States. Where does anti-Semitism start?
Thank you.
Thank you, Manfred, for that very flattering introduction. Can you all hear me? Okay? I'm always very pleased to be introduced in flattering terms, and not because it tickles my vanity, although, of course, that's always very pleasant, but because it gives me a natural opportunity to tell my favorite Jewish joke, which some of you may have heard. It's a joke about, takes place in an unlikely venue on a deathbed where a very elderly Hasidic Rebbe is lying in very close to death and surrounded by his Hasidim, who are weeping and wailing and tearing their clothes, and one of them says, "Oy vavoy oy veyes uns," what will we do upon the death of our Rebbe? He is the wisest man of the age, and who will teach us wisdom when he is gone. And the second said, oh, weh is uns, what will we do without our Rebbe? He is the most learned man of the age, and who will teach us Torah when he is gone? And the third said, what will we do without our Rebbe? He is the most ethical man of the age, and who will set us an example of proper moral behavior when he is gone? And they wept and they wailed and they tore their clothes. And finally the old man, with the last ounce of strength in his failing body, lifts himself up on his elbow and says, and about my humility you have nothing to say? In Yiddish, von meiner Nieves hat gar nichts zu sagen. I note that Manfred had nothing to say about my humility, for which I am extremely well known on several continents. I'm not I hope you enjoyed that laugh, because it's probably the last laugh you're going to get out of me today. I've been asked to talk about the extent to which the attacks on neoconservatism in America, and indeed all over the world, have been anti-Semitic in either intent or effect. The short answer to this question, and to what extent is this true? And the short answer to that question is to a very, very considerable extent, at least 90%, I would say. But let me try to, I have to confess, I'm not sure, looking at this audience, how familiar most of you are with some of this terminology, or with the kinds of charges that have been made about the neoconservative, so-called neoconservative cabal. And I want to apologize in advance if I'm telling you things that you already know, but it's difficult for me to assume that some of you may be familiar with this whole phenomenon. So with that advance apology, let me begin by simply describing what has been said in the last, well, at least a year, maybe 2 years, about the role of the so-called neoconservatives in American foreign policy. The overall charge is that a group of people called, as you will see not very accurately, neoconservatives, have conspired to seize control of American foreign policy, working more or less secretly in the interests of Israel, and not just of Israel, but of the Likud party and of Arik Sharon, basically agents of Sharon. And in line with this role, they have dragged the United States into war in Iraq. In other words, you have now, it's often pointed out either explicitly or with hints, sodot u'remazim, I guess you would call it in Hebrew, that all these people are Jews. And so what we're told, and I've read something like 200 articles on this subject in the press, both in the United States and throughout the world, even in China and Japan and India, Pakistan. What we're asked to believe is that several American Jews have fooled the likes of not just George Bush, but Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Condi Rice, into following a policy against their own will, and that is not in the interest of the United States. Now, to anybody familiar with the history of anti-Semitism, this will all sound almost cliched. The only missing element, I mean, there are charges of this kind made against the Jews even before World War II in the United States, when the American Jewish community was much weaker and less influential than it is today. The Nazis even spread the story around that Roosevelt was Jewish. His real name was supposedly Rosenfeld. That's the only new element in this latest critique. I keep expecting to hear that Rumsfeld's real name is, I don't know, Rumpelstein or something. But I haven't yet seen him accused of being Jewish. Well, that's perhaps because he is so quintessentially Goyish in his personality. I say that in praise of him, not in criticism. Well, this idea, this general idea, has been very, very widely disseminated, and it is very, very widely believed by surprising numbers of people, and people who you would not expect to fall for such a canard, people who might be expected to know better. Those people who might be expected to know better, of course, have developed a much more sophisticated version of the charge that I've just described. They go back and find the roots of this conspiracy in Trotskyism and in the teachings of Leo Strauss, of whom most people have never heard. And they find doctrines both in, I'll get to that in a minute, but both in the Trotskyist movement of the past and in the writings of Leo Strauss that make the neoconservative conspiracy seem even more insidious and malignant than it would appear to ordinary anti-Semites who are less profound in their reach. Well, what in fact is the truth? I mean, there's something like most defamatory ideas. There's generally some little kernel, little element of truth on which they build. And there is something going on in American foreign policy in the Bush administration that has supplied the foundation for these anti-Semitic, well, I'll tell you in a minute why I think it's anti-Semitic. Let me reserve that. But the element of truth is that there are indeed a number of people in influential positions in the Bush administration who are, how shall I put it, of Jewish origin, and who are roughly, more or less roughly, of the tendency or school of thought that came to be called neoconservatism. Now, I should tell you that, for those of you who don't know, in many of these articles, I am identified with some accuracy as one of the founding fathers of neoconservatism. It doesn't make me feel any younger to be described that way, sort of like, you know, Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin. So I speak with some authority, I think, when it comes to this subject. The group in question, there are about 5 or 6 of them whose names keep coming up in the articles I referred to, occupy positions for the most part either in the Pentagon, working under Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, or in the White House, generally working under Vice President Cheney, and there is at least one who is in the White House working under Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor. That one happens to be my son-in-law, but that's another story. Now, in what sense are these people neoconservatives? What is a neoconservative? The term has now been so broadened and used so promiscuously that most people hearing it think, okay, a neoconservative, that's a Jewish hawk. You know, in fact, what is? Let me tell you a little bit, for those of you who are not familiar with the phenomenon, what exactly a neoconservative is. Neoconservatism was born in the 1960s. It represented a reaction by people who had formerly been on the left, either somewhere to the left of center. They might have been liberals in the Democratic Party or radicals associated with one or another radical tradition, whether Marxist or social, or social democratic, somewhere on the left. And a rather small number of intellectuals who had spent most of their political lives, all their political lives on the left, began to feel uneasy with what was happening to the liberal and, in general, leftist community in the United States. And without any kind of collusion, I mean, these various individuals were actually as individuals, began questioning some of the assumptions that they had taken for granted all their political lives. And mainly what they were doing, I call it in a book I wrote about my own development into a neoconservative, they were breaking ranks with the left to begin with. They were, and in this sense, they were rather like an earlier generation of communists who broke with the Communist Party in the 1930s. Without having any clear idea of where they were going, mainly what they were saying was no to what they had been committed to in the past. There were many different motives driving the neoconservatives of the first generation. In my own case, for example, I was repelled by the growth of anti-American sentiment on the left. The sheer hatred of America that began to pervade the circles in which I moved and in which I was frankly considered a leader. And even at my most radical, I never hated America. I mean, my idea was to perfect America, not to destroy it. But more and more, my friends and comrades were taking the position that America was evil in itself and the source of evil all over the world. And this was an idea I simply could not stomach. And when they began comparing America to Nazi Germany, that was the time for me to get off the train. And I broke with the left. Other people had other motives. Some felt that left-wing liberal or socialist ideas were simply not working, were not viable, were more concerned with the course of domestic policy. It would take me several hours to map out the various courses of development. The point is that it was a movement by leftists against leftism. That was the main element. As time went on, some of us did develop alternative points of view. We moved more and more in a rightward direction, some further to the right than others. Again, there's not a movement, it has no party line. Many of the members, as it were, of this tendence or disposition are not on speaking terms with the others. I mean, it's difficult to conspire with somebody if you're not speaking to him. Now, this movement turned out, I shouldn't call it a movement, I call it a tendency. It turned out to be quite influential through the 1970s, mainly in the world of ideas, in the war of ideas. What happened was that Commentary magazine, of which I was the editor, became a main center for the development of a critique of American foreign policy, for example. There was the Public Interest magazine edited by Irving Kristol, which mainly focused on domestic policy. But let me restrict myself to commentary because that's what's relevant to today's critique. Am I going on too long?
No, it goes.
We were very critical. I mean, there were a group of individuals, many of whom began publishing articles in Commentary, including myself. We attacked the whole philosophy and practice of détente. We were called for a tougher foreign policy. We did not believe that the Soviet Union had reached a point where it wanted peaceful relations with the United States. We were worried about the Soviet threat, both ideological and military. And we kept arguing mainly against the policies of the Nixon administration, and then even more strongly against the policies of the Carter administration, which we regarded as amounting in the end to appeasement. Now, what happened was, to our immense surprise, what happened was that two major events occurred in the world out there in quick succession. And now I'm getting so old I can't remember which came first. The seizure of the American hostages in Iran and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Which came first, or you don't remember either?
Afghanistan was 1990.
No, they were
No,
both, they
Afghanistan
were
was
both,
79.
79. No, 79.
Shah fell the end of
They were
78.
6 weeks apart, doesn't matter. I mean, these two things happened almost, one after another. And the result of those two events, the Soviet seizure, the seizure of the hostages, American hostages in Iran, vindicated the idea that many of us had been pressing, that the decline of American power, as we had seen it throughout the 70s, had real consequences. That they dared to do this to the United States when they would, for example, never have dared to take Russian hostages, showed that there were real consequences for the decline of American power. And we had been arguing this for 10 years. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan showed that the Soviet Union was not, as the proponents of détente had been arguing, a status quo power, that they were still expansionist. Now, these two events served to vindicate the entire point of view that we had been developing so strenuously, and by the way, in such isolation. I mean, I've often compared the neoconservatives of the 1970s to the cavalry in the Western films, fighting against thousands of Indians, and there are only 6 of them, and they run from rock to rock, firing to give the impression that they're a big army. That's really what we were like. There were about 6 of us running from rock to rock, firing in the air. What happened was that because there was a set of ideas that was persuasive, was coherent, internally coherent, that had now been vindicated by events, which had been competing with another set of ideas which had been pretty well discredited by events, our ideas prevailed. And a candidate for president who shared those ideas, he didn't get all of them from us, though he did, I have to say, Ronald Reagan I'm talking about, of course, did get some of them from us, including, I say, in my famous humility, from me, as he acknowledged once very generously, became a viable candidate, which he had not been before. If it hadn't been Ronald Reagan, it probably would have been somebody else. But in any event, someone with that point of view became a plausible candidate for president, and indeed he won. In that sense, so the neoconservatism got to be considered very, very influential. But it was influential with the help of historical events that demonstrated that we had been right all along. Now, even in the first Gulf War, I'm going to jump now. I mean, I can't go through the whole history. Let me jump now to this new generation of so-called neoconservatives. The names familiar to all of you were Richard Pearl, who's not even in the government, by the way, in this administration, an outside advisor to the Defense Department, Doug Feith, who's an Undersecretary of Defense in the Pentagon, Paul Wolfowitz, who was, well, Doug Feith, I should have mentioned him first, who was superior to Feith. He's the #2 man in the Defense Department. And you have several other players, as I say, in the White House, including Elliott Abrams and 1 or 2 others, somewhat less well known. All these men are indeed of Jewish origin. And they do indeed play an important role in the Bush administration. Question is, two questions really. How important is their Jewishness, and what exactly is the role that they play? Well, to begin with the Jewishness, it varies. I mean, I've always laughed at the idea that, say, Richard Pearl is an Israeli agent. You know, I've known Richard Pearl for, I don't know, 30 years. So a lot of these people I first met when they were working for Senator Scoop Jackson. They were actually on his staff. Pearl was, Abrams was, I think Feith also was for a time. As far as I mean, I had many, many conversations with Richard Pearl over the years, and I don't remember him once mentioning the state of Israel. I mean, his passionate concern was the Soviet Union, and especially arms control. Now, it's true that he's Jewish, and he's for Israel in some way, and I think now more than before, but certainly the idea that his animating passion is Israel seems to me simply ridiculous on the basis of my personal knowledge. Doug Feith is actually more concerned about Israel, and so is Elliot Abrams. Paul Wolfowitz is rather ambiguous in his position on Israel. He's by no means a hardliner. He's by no means a Sharon or Likud supporter, for example. So you can say that Jewishness is really quite irrelevant, or certainly it has no implication for any connection with Sharon or Israel in general. As for the role these guys play, well, most of them work for somebody higher, you know, and the idea that Don Rumsfeld, whom I've also known for a long time, could be pushed around or fooled by anybody, whether Paul Wolfowitz or Doug Feith or any, 18 more like them, is ridiculous. It's just simply a fantasy out of anti-Semitic mythology. So what exactly the role that they play as neoconservatives is, to the extent that it plays a role, is very similar to the role that neoconservatism played originally with Ronald Reagan. That is to say, when after 9/11, George Bush, who was, if anything, in his thinking about foreign policy, a traditional realist in the mold of his father, balance of power, non-moral considerations, suddenly saw the world in a new way after 9/11. And the new way in which he saw the world was very close to the neoconservative point of view. Because after the fall of the Soviet Union, indeed even before the fall of the Soviet Union, we had been, in Commentary magazine, talking about the threat of terrorism and the return of Islam. As early as 1976, the first article Bernard Lewis wrote on this subject, called The Return of Islam, appeared in Commentary. And we had, in more recent years, been very critical of the policy taken by the Clinton administration in fighting the many terrorist assaults, and also the Reagan administration before it. They had treated it as a crime problem. You know, the terrorist, you catch him, you read him his Miranda rights, and then you take, what the Miranda, you have the right to be silent, you have the right to, you read him his Miranda rights and you take him to court. We thought that this was a